The voice on the recording is calm at first. That is the part that stays with people who have heard it. Not the words, not what she describes, but the steadiness in her breathing during the first 40 seconds before everything changes into something that trained 911 dispatchers spend entire careers hoping never to encounter. She called from a landline inside her home in Harlow Creek, Oregon, a small unincorporated community of roughly 800 people nestled between a ridge of Douglas firs and a two-lane highway that most maps still label correctly, and that a handful of researchers now believe may be one of the most important geographic coordinates in any documented case of this kind. The date was March 9, 2004. The time was 3:07 in the morning. The call was received and connected to dispatcher Carol Ann Vreeland, who had worked the overnight shift at the Tillamook County Emergency Communications Center for 11 years, and who described in a written statement filed 6 months later that there was something in the quality of the silence between the woman's words. Not emptiness exactly, but pressure, the kind you feel in your ears before a storm changes direction. The woman said her name was Ruth Maren Aldiss. She said she was 31 years old and she lived alone. She said there was something standing outside her bedroom window, and then she described it. That description, which lasted approximately 4 minutes and which was recorded in its entirety on the county dispatch system under case intake log number TCE 2004-0309-0307, is the reason this case exists at all. It is also the reason the case was almost buried 4 times by 4 separate agencies across 2 states and 1 federal jurisdiction. The description Ruth Aldiss gave does not correspond to any known classification of threat, and it does not match any prior witness statement on file with law enforcement in Oregon or Washington going back to 1983. But it does match, with a precision that several independent researchers have called either remarkable or deeply troubling, descriptions filed in 17 other 911 calls across 11 states over a period spanning from 1991 to 2003. Those calls were never connected in any official capacity. They were made by people who did not know each other, had never traveled to the same locations, and shared no documented social or professional networks. Ruth Aldiss did not know any of them. She could not have known. And yet the thing she described standing outside her window in the Oregon dark at 3 in the morning was, detail by detail, the same thing. What you are about to hear is not a ghost story in the way that phrase usually functions as a warning or a dismissal. This is a documentation of something that happened and then kept happening across more than a decade and across a geography too vast to be explained by coincidence and too consistent to be explained by mass hysteria. Ruth Aldiss made a phone call. The line stayed open. For 11 years, 2 months and 17 days, that line stayed open, maintained by a sequence of events so improbable that the telecommunications engineer who first analyzed the records in 2014 submitted his findings to 3 different academic journals before finding one willing to publish a heavily redacted version. The call was never formally closed. It was never formally classified. It exists in the county system today in a status field that reads, in the plain gray font of a database designed for emergencies with conclusions, as pending. If you have ever woken at exactly 3 in the morning without knowing why, and lay there in the particular quality of silence that feels less like the absence of sound and more like the presence of something listening, then you already understand something about this story that no report has ever fully articulated. This is what this case is about, not the window, not the figure, but the part of you that already knew, before you clicked on this video, that some calls do not end just because someone stops speaking. If you have never been to this channel before, Unresolved exists for exactly this kind of story. not to frighten you and not to entertain you in the way that word implies a comfortable distance between you and the material, but to take seriously the things that serious people have documented and that serious institutions have failed to explain, and to present them with the same care and thoroughness that the people involved deserved and in most cases never received. Subscribe if you want to be part of a community that refuses to look away. I want to stop here and ask you something directly. Have you ever called for help and felt in the silence after the call connected that the person on the other end was not entirely sure they believed you? Have you ever tried to describe something and felt the words failing you in real time, not because you did not know what you saw, but because there was no language built for it yet? If that is familiar to you, leave a comment below. You can copy and paste this if you want. I know what it is to describe something that has no name. Your comment tells the next person who finds this video that they are not the only one. The community of Harlow Creek sits at an elevation of approximately 1,240 feet above sea level in the northwestern corner of Tillamook County, approximately 19 miles from the nearest incorporated city. The access road, a county-maintained two-lane strip designated as Rural Route 7C, is effectively impassable for roughly 6 weeks each winter. The community in 2004 consisted of 63 residential structures, of which 41 were occupied year-round, a volunteer fire station, a general store that closed at 6 in the evening, and no cell phone coverage. Everyone in Harlow Creek used landlines. Ruth Aldiss used the landline she had inherited along with the house when she moved there from Portland in the summer of 2003, 8 months before the night in question, to take a position as a research librarian at a county archive facility in Tillamook. Ruth Aldiss was not someone who called 911. This detail, which appears minor and becomes essential, is confirmed by multiple sources. She was 31 years old. She had a graduate degree in library science from the University of Oregon. She had lived alone since the age of 26. Her supervisor at the county archive, a woman named Patricia Holbrook, described her as methodical, precise, and not given to unnecessary communication, meaning that when Ruth said something she had thought about whether it needed to be said. Her neighbor to the north, a retired teacher named Gordon Spears, who had lived in Harlow Creek for 22 years, said in a recorded interview conducted in 2014 that in the 8 months Ruth Aldiss lived next to him, he had seen her twice. He said she seemed like someone who was exactly where she had chosen to be. He said he had no idea anything was wrong until the morning the county sheriff's vehicle came up Route 7C and parked in her driveway. The call came in at 3:07 a.m. Carol Ann Vreeland had been on shift since 11 and had handled 14 calls that night. She described the call as connecting with a clarity that surprised her, since most calls from Harlow Creek were slightly degraded due to the age of the telephone infrastructure in the valley. This call was clear. She said it was the clearest call she had received all night. Ruth Aldiss identified herself immediately, gave her address on Fern Hollow Road without being asked, and said, "I need to report something standing outside my bedroom window." The figure, as Ruth described it across the next 4 minutes, was standing approximately 8 feet from the exterior wall of her house, just at the edge of the range illuminated by the motion-activated porch light that had been triggered by its presence. It was tall, somewhere between 6.5 and 7 feet. It was standing still in a way she found difficult to explain, eventually settling on the phrase, "not the way people stand still," which Carol Ann Vreeland recorded verbatim in her incident notes. It had no visible features that corresponded to a human face. She said this carefully, not as someone terrified into imprecision, but as someone making a deliberate effort to separate what she observed from what she might have expected to observe. She said, "I can see a shape where the face would be. It is not a face." She paused. She said, "It is oriented toward me." Ruth said the figure appeared to be wearing a long coat or covering of some kind, dark in color, and that its arms were positioned at its sides at an angle that was slightly wrong, not quite matching what elbows and shoulders would produce. She said the porch light had been on since the figure arrived, and that the figure had not moved in the 3 minutes she had been watching it before calling. She said, and this is the sentence that Carol Ann Vreeland underlined twice in her handwritten notes, and that would be cited in every subsequent analysis of the call, that she did not believe it was capable of looking away. Carol Ann Vreeland dispatched a county sheriff's deputy to Fern Hollow Road at 3:11 a.m. The deputy, Stephen Okafor, arrived at the property at 3:47 a.m., 36 minutes after dispatch, due to road conditions on Route 7C. During those 36 minutes, the line remained open. Ruth stayed on the phone, and Carol Ann stayed on the line with her. The figure did not move. She described it several more times during that period. She said at 3:23 a.m. that she thought its shape had changed slightly. Not that it had moved, but that something about its proportions seemed different. She said at 3:31 a.m. that she had turned on the interior bedroom light and that the figure had not reacted. At 3:44 a.m., 3 minutes before Deputy Okafor's arrival, Ruth Aldiss said, "It knows you sent someone." Carol Ann asked her what she meant. Ruth said, "It's different now. It's waiting differently." And then Deputy Okafor's headlights came up the driveway and the porch light clicked off. Deputy Okafor reported, in his incident report filed the following morning under case number TCSO 2004-03-1847, that upon arriving at the property he observed no persons or figures of any kind on the exterior. He conducted a perimeter walk with his flashlight. He observed no footprints in the area beneath the bedroom window, though he noted the ground there was covered with a layer of decomposed fir needles, approximately 2 inches deep, that would not reliably hold a footprint. He observed no disturbance to the vegetation around the perimeter. He knocked on the front door at 3:51 a.m. Ruth Aldiss opened it. He described her in his report as calm and alert. He noted that she was fully dressed, meaning she had not been in bed when the incident began. His report concluded with the phrase, "No evidence of criminal activity observed," and a recommendation for a follow-up welfare check within 72 hours, which was conducted 3 days later by a different deputy who found Ruth at home in good health and unwilling to provide any additional statement. The call was logged as resolved in the county dispatch system at 4:02 a.m. on March 9, 2004. That is what the system shows. What the system also shows, and what was not discovered for more than 3 years, is that the audio recording of the call was never terminated. The recording continued past 4:02 a.m. It continued past the moment Deputy Okafor left the property at 4:14 a.m. It continued through the rest of the night and through the days and weeks and months that followed. When the technical discrepancy was discovered in the summer of 2007 by a county IT contractor named Marcus Webb performing a routine audit of the dispatch system's storage allocation, the recording had been running for 3 years, 4 months, and 12 days. Marcus Webb submitted an internal report describing the anomaly as the result of a software failure in the call termination protocol. His supervisor authorized a full diagnostic of the dispatch system. The diagnostic found no fault. It found no software error. It found no mechanism by which the call could have remained open without being actively maintained by both endpoints, meaning by both the dispatch system and the telephone at the originating number. The telephone at the originating number was the landline at Ruth Aldiss's house on Fern Hollow Road. Ruth Aldiss had vacated the property 11 weeks after the initial call on May 24, 2004. The house had not sat empty in the years between Ruth's departure and Marcus Webb's discovery. A couple from Astoria named Brian and Kathleen Moorfield moved in during August of 2004, and stayed 7 months before terminating their lease in February of 2005, without explanation. In a phone interview conducted in 2015, Brian Moorfield said only that the house had a quality he could not describe that made sleeping difficult, and that Kathleen had developed what he called a feeling about the bedroom specifically that had intensified over 7 months until it became, in his word, unbearable. He said nothing had ever happened in any way that he could point to and name. He said it was subtler than that, and that subtler was the only word he had for it. A seasonal forestry worker named Joseph Candler occupied the house for 4 months in late 2006, left without incident, and said nothing about the phone. The house was empty again, and the recording ran. Marcus Webb listened to 11 minutes of the recording before stopping. He noted that the audio quality was consistent with an open line in an empty residential space, ambient sound only, no voices, no movement, the baseline hiss of an active connection. He noted that at one point during those 11 minutes, there was a sound he described as not classifiable using the standard dispatch audio taxonomy, which categorized sounds into background noise, voice, mechanical, environmental, and interference. He put it in the interference category and did not elaborate. His supervisor, Gail Tremblay, listened to 30 seconds of the recording before closing it. She noted in her forwarding email that the recording was distressing in a way she could not quantify. She recommended deletion. The county communications director recommended preservation pending review. The review produced no conclusions. The file remained in the system. The file, by July of 2007, was 10.4 terabytes in size, larger than the entire storage allocation for all other calls in the system combined for that period. The system had not failed or flagged this storage use at any point. It had simply made room, in a way that Marcus Webb described in his internal report as not consistent with any storage management protocol he had encountered in 14 years of IT work, and kept recording. If you are watching this and thinking about how many times something important was almost deleted or ignored before someone finally looked at it carefully enough, go ahead and hit the like button. The people who paid attention carefully to this case are the only reason we know what we know. The independent researcher who assembled the full picture was a woman named Ruth Maren Aldiss, a former nurse practitioner from Eugene who had been following cases involving 911 anomalies for 9 years when she first encountered a brief mention of the Harlow Creek recording in a 2009 magazine article about rural emergency communications infrastructure. She filed a FOIA request in March of 2013. She was denied on grounds that the file was classified as an active case, which by 2013 was not only technically incorrect but legally indefensible, as the county's own records showed no active case number associated with it. She appealed. The process took 14 months. In May of 2014, she received access to a compressed and truncated version of the recording, the first 47 minutes of the original call and approximately 6 hours of discrete audio segments drawn from various points across the 11 years, selected by the county IT office according to criteria described only as representative sampling. Sylvie listened to all of it. She documented what she heard in a 340-page report titled The Open Line, an unresolved case study in persistent emergency communication anomaly, self-published in September of 2014. What she noted in the first 47 minutes was consistent in its main outlines with the incident report already discussed, but she documented several things absent from the written record. She noted that Ruth's breathing pattern changed at approximately 3:23 a.m., a slight shortening of the exhale, the kind of respiratory shift that happens when a person's nervous system registers something before the conscious mind has processed it. She noted that at 3:38 a.m., when Ruth mentioned thinking about opening the window, there was a sound in the background of the recording, lasting approximately 1.4 seconds, that did not correspond to anything Ruth had described in the environment. It was not a voice. It was not mechanical. It was not classifiable. Sylvie wrote that she listened to that 1.4-second segment 47 times across 3 separate sessions, and that on each occasion her body responded in the same way. A full body contraction, brief and involuntary, the kind associated with sudden cold or the moment before impact. She wrote that she did not include this as evidence of anything because it was not evidence of anything. It was, she wrote, a data point about the limits of available categorization. The segments drawn from across the 11 years of recording were more difficult to document. Some were genuinely ambient, the sound of an empty room, wind against glass, a heating system cycling. One segment from what the county IT office had labeled as approximately year 3 contained a sequence across 9 minutes that Sylvie characterized as follows, in her own words, a low periodic tone at a frequency between 40 and 60 Hz, present for 3 minutes and 14 seconds, followed by a period of silence qualitatively different from the ambient silence of other segments, and then sounds I can only describe as movement in a space that should not contain movement, the acoustic signature of weight shifting on a wooden floor, audible twice, separated by approximately 40 seconds, in a house that had been empty for more than a year. Sylvie cross-referenced the date markers on those segments against the property management records and determined that the floor sounds corresponded to a period in the second quarter of 2007, during which the house was definitively unoccupied. The sounds were recorded by a telephone sitting in its cradle on a kitchen counter in an empty house. Ruth Aldiss had not been definitively located by any researcher or agency since her Aunt Margaret last spoke with her in November of 2003, 4 months before the call. No missing persons report was ever filed for her. She was not reported missing because the gap between her and her family was wide enough that her absence looked, from every angle where absences are usually noticed, like a choice. Her last documentable actions were as follows. She gave notice to the property management company on May 10, 2004. She was last confirmed present at the county archive on May 19, 2004, the day she left a voicemail for Patricia Holbrook saying she would not be returning and that she was sorry for the inconvenience. Patricia told Sylvie that Ruth's voice in the voicemail was the same as always, but that there was something underneath it she identified only as someone who has made a decision they know is not really a decision. Sylvie Oates spent 2 pages of her report turning that phrase over. She drew no conclusion she could not support. What she could support was the pattern. Sylvie spent 18 months before publication, cross-referencing the description Ruth had given against 911 call records she had obtained through FOIA requests to dispatch centers in 11 states. She was looking for specific details: a figure at a window in the pre-dawn hours, standing outside a residence occupied by a single adult, unmoving, tall and dark, described as oriented toward the witness, described as standing in a way that felt wrong without the witness being able to specify why, described with reference to a face that was not a face. She found 17 calls across 11 states. The earliest was from March of 1991, originating from a rural community in eastern Montana. The most recent was from November of 2003, 4 months before Ruth Aldiss's call, originating from a rural community in Western Virginia. All 17 callers were women. All 17 were living alone at the time of the call. All 17 called between 2:30 and 3:45 in the morning, and all 17, when Sylvie attempted to locate them through public record searches, could not be found. Not one, not a current address, not a current employer, not a voter registration, not a tax filing. 17 women who had each described the same figure in the same hours across 13 years. And then, in each case, nothing. An absence that began quietly, that no one had filed paperwork about, that looked exactly like a person who had simply chosen to be elsewhere. Sylvie presents this pattern without a conclusion. She identifies 3 possible frameworks and examines each carefully. The coincidence framework she presents honestly and then dismantles. The probability that 17 demographically similar individuals across 11 states would independently produce descriptions of this specificity without any shared cultural reference point is, she calculates, astronomically small. The organized criminal framework she examines seriously and then sets aside on the grounds that the geographic distribution, the 13-year time span, the complete absence of physical evidence, and the impossibility of a coherent motive make it descriptively inadequate. The third framework she describes simply as the possibility that something about these specific circumstances produces contact with a phenomenon that does not yet have a name in any discipline prepared to study it rigorously. She does not argue for this framework. She presents it as the residual category, the space left when the more comfortable explanations have been fairly tested and found insufficient. A retired FBI behavioral analyst named Thomas Kearney reviewed the open line in 2015 and published his assessment in a long-form post on a research forum associated with a network of independent investigators. He had spent 26 years in the Behavioral Analysis Unit working on cases involving pattern behavior across multiple geographic locations. He described Sylvie's methodology as rigorous and her evidentiary standards as higher than some federal case documentation he had encountered in his career. He stated plainly that the pattern Sylvie had documented was, in his professional assessment, a pattern, meaning not the accumulation of independent events, but the repeated occurrence of the same event across different locations and individuals. He said that what the pattern meant was a question he could not answer and that he was not sure anyone currently could. He said the disappearance of all 17 callers was the detail he found most important and most difficult to look at directly. He said that in his experience, people who encounter something genuinely new, something that falls entirely outside their existing framework for understanding the world, respond in one of 2 ways. They dismiss it, which is how the brain protects its architecture, or they follow it, which is how the architecture changes. He said all 17 women appeared to have followed it. He did not say where it led. The recording ran until March 14, 2015, when the Tillamook County dispatch system was migrated to a new infrastructure platform as part of a statewide emergency communications upgrade. The migration required the termination of all active call records. A technician employed by the migration contractor, a company called Pac West Telecom Solutions, terminated the record at 2:47 a.m., which Sylvie Oates noted in a postscript added after original publication. The call was terminated in the pre-dawn hours, the same hours when all the calls had been made. The full 10.4 terabyte file was not transferred to the new system. It was deleted during migration. The deletion confirmation form was processed and filed. 3 weeks later, the technician, whose name appears in county records as Nathan Price, submitted a resignation from Pac West without explanation. His former supervisor, contacted in 2016 by a researcher named Adam Cassidy, working on a follow-up to Sylvie's report, said Nathan had been reliable and technically proficient for 7 years, and that his resignation had been unexpected. The supervisor said that Nathan had mentioned after the migration was complete that the deletion had not felt like deletion. He said Nathan had used those specific words. The supervisor did not know what Nathan had meant. He said he had not asked. The house on Fern Hollow Road in Harlow Creek is currently listed in Tillamook County property records as an active residential rental. The current tenants moved from Portland in August of 2022. They have not contacted law enforcement. They have not contacted any researcher. The landline telephone that sat in the kitchen during the years of the recording is no longer there. The bedroom window faces north, toward a stand of Douglas firs that are now tall enough to block most of the light from the motion-activated porch lamp, which was replaced in 2011 and which still activates when something crosses its sensor after dark. The county dispatch system, running on its new infrastructure, assigns case numbers in a different format than the one that produced TCE 2004-0309-0307. There are no anomalous files in the system. There are no open recordings running in the background of any server. Everything checks out. The system is clean. Sylvie Oates finished the open line with a paragraph that has been quoted in every subsequent piece of writing about this case. She wrote, "I do not know what Ruth Aldiss saw outside her window on the morning of March 9th, 2004. I do not know what the recording captured during 11 years in an empty house. I do not know where Ruth Aldiss is, or the 17 women whose descriptions match hers, or Nathan Price, or anyone else who has passed through this case and come out changed in ways that ordinary life does not prepare a person to describe. What I know is that the call was made, and the line stayed open, and that something on the other end of that line was, for 11 years, present. I do not use that word carelessly. I have thought about every alternative, and I keep arriving at the same one. Present, whatever that means. Whatever it requires us to mean, when we use it for something that did not call, that did not identify itself, that did not ask for anything, that simply remained in the dark in the hours before dawn, in a room that everyone had left, for 11 years present. If this story has settled somewhere in you that you cannot quite locate, if you are going to be thinking about it tonight in the particular quiet of those hours, then you already understand why this case has not been resolved using the tools we currently have. The line is closed now. The file is compressed. The house has different tenants and trees that have grown tall enough to block some of the light. Everything has changed except the window. The window faces north. It still does. And if you find yourself checking your windows tonight, not because you believe anything in particular, but because something in the back of your brain has decided to be careful, that is not irrational. That is the oldest part of you doing exactly what it was built to do. That is the part that was always paying attention, even when you were sleeping, especially then.